The candles at Ashcombe Hall burned low, but the tension in the room burned brighter. Evelyn Hartley stood near the long dining table, her voice steady even as every eye in the room turned toward her. She had just said something no one expected a young woman to say aloud, and the silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. "A woman cannot manage land the way a man can," the Duke of Ravensworth had said moments before, his tone smooth and certain, as if the matter required no discussion. Evelyn had disagreed. She had spoken of tenant farms she had watched her father run, of ledgers she had balanced herself, of decisions she had made when illness kept her father from his duties. She had not raised her voice. She had not been rude. She had simply spoken the truth as she saw it. The Duke's eyes had narrowed, and something cold had settled into his expression. He set down his glass with a quiet, deliberate click against the table. "Know your place," he said. The words landed like a slap, though he never raised his hand. Around the table, forks paused mid-air. A young gentleman near the end of the table cleared his throat. Someone's chair creaked as they shifted, uncomfortable, unwilling to meet Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn felt her face grow warm, not with shame, but with something sharper. Anger, yes, but beneath it, a strange and sudden clarity. She looked at the Duke, at his composed face, at the way he seemed to believe the conversation was already finished, that she would simply nod and retreat into silence like every other woman in that room had learned to do. She did not nod. "I know my place well enough, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but unshaking. "It is simply larger than the one you have imagined for me." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, only lifted his glass again as though the matter were beneath further comment. Evelyn did not wait to be dismissed. She rose from her chair, offered a polite curtsy to her hostess, and walked from the dining room with her back straight and her chin high. Only when she reached the corridor outside, away from watching eyes, did her hands begin to tremble. She found her aunt, Margaret Fenwick, waiting near the entrance hall, having heard enough of the exchange through the open doors to guess what had happened. "Evelyn," Margaret said gently, taking her niece's arm. "Come, let us leave this house tonight." "Gladly," Evelyn said, though her voice cracked slightly on the word. They rode home in the dark, the carriage wheels rattling over uneven country roads, the moon casting pale light through the small window. Margaret said little, sensing that her niece needed silence more than comfort. Evelyn stared out at the passing fields, at the shadowed outlines of hedgerows and distant farmhouses, and let the Duke's words echo again and again in her mind. "Know your place." She had heard such words before, in smaller ways, from smaller men, but never so plainly, never so publicly, and never from a man whose opinion carried so much weight in the county. The Duke of Ravensworth was not merely wealthy. He was influential, respected, feared in the quiet way that powerful men are feared. His judgment of her would follow her, whispered from drawing room to drawing room, unless she gave people a reason to remember her differently. By the time the carriage reached her family's modest home, Evelyn's sadness had hardened into something else. Resolve. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, replaying the dinner in her mind, not with regret, but with a strange, growing determination. She thought of her father, who had died 2 years earlier, and how he had always told her that land was not a matter of birth, but of care. He had taught her how to read a ledger before she was 10 years old. He had taken her with him to walk the fields, to speak with tenants, to understand the slow, patient work of keeping an estate alive. Her mother had worried it was improper. Her father had only laughed and said that knowledge was never improper, only sometimes inconvenient for those who wished to keep it from others. The next morning, Evelyn rose early, dressed simply, and walked out into the garden behind her home. The autumn air was crisp, the grass silvered with frost, and she found herself standing at the low stone wall that marked the edge of her family's small property, looking out over the gentle hills beyond. She thought of Fairmont, an old estate she had heard mentioned only in passing, a place fallen into disrepair after its last owner died without an heir willing to take it on. She had heard the name before, mostly in complaints about untended fields and crumbling fences, a property everyone agreed was a burden rather than a prize. But an idea, small and strange at first, began to take root in her mind. Fairmont, she recalled, bordered the Duke's own land. She said nothing of the thought to her aunt that morning, not wanting to give voice to something so improbable before she understood it herself. Instead, she busied herself with ordinary tasks, helping in the kitchen, mending a torn hem, reading quietly by the window. But the idea did not leave her. It grew quieter and stronger, taking shape with every hour that passed. That afternoon, a letter arrived. delivered by a rider who had come some distance. Margaret opened it first, her eyebrows lifting in surprise as she read. "Evelyn," she said, glancing up, "this concerns you." The letter was from a solicitor in London, informing Evelyn that her late great-uncle, a man she had met only twice in her life, had passed away, and that he had left her a portion of his estate. The amount named in the letter was not vast, but it was significant, more money than Evelyn had ever imagined she might one day possess on her own. She read the letter twice, her heart beating faster with each line. It felt, for a moment, as though fate itself had chosen to answer the anger she had carried home the night before. Margaret watched her niece's face carefully. "You are thinking of something," she said. It was not a question. Evelyn folded the letter slowly. "I am thinking," she said, "that perhaps it is time I stopped waiting to be given a place, and simply built one for myself." Margaret's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Evelyn, what is it you intend?" Evelyn walked to the window and looked out over the hills once more, in the direction she knew, roughly, that Fairmont lay. "I intend," she said quietly, "to buy land of my own." Margaret did not laugh, though many others might have. She had known her niece long enough to recognize when a decision had already been made, long before it was spoken aloud. "And where," Margaret asked carefully, "do you intend to buy this land?" Evelyn turned back to face her aunt, and for the first time since the dinner the night before, something like a smile touched her lips, small and sharp and entirely certain. "Fairmont," she said. "It borders his estate." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. Then, slowly, she shook her head, though not in disapproval. There was something else in her expression, something closer to admiration mixed with worry. "You mean to become his neighbor," Margaret said slowly, "after what he said to you?" "I mean," Evelyn said, "to become someone he cannot dismiss." Margaret studied her niece's face for a long moment, searching perhaps for some sign of foolishness or wounded pride, driving the decision rather than clear thought. But what she saw instead was steadiness, a quiet fire, banked but burning. "It will not be easy," Margaret said finally. "A young woman, unmarried, managing an estate alone. People will talk." "People are already talking," Evelyn said. "At least this way, they will have something worth discussing." Margaret let out a breath that was almost a laugh, shaking her head at her niece's stubbornness, though there was warmth in it. "Your father would be proud of you," she said, "and terrified for you, in equal measure." Evelyn's throat tightened at the mention of her father, but she did not let the emotion show for long. She folded the solicitor's letter carefully and placed it inside the drawer of her writing desk, where she kept the few papers that mattered most to her. That evening, as the house grew quiet and the fire in the sitting room burned low, Evelyn sat with a sheet of paper before her, a pen in hand, and began to write. Not a letter of complaint, not a plea for sympathy, but a list. Questions to ask, figures to calculate. Names of solicitors and land agents who might help her understand what buying and restoring an estate like Fairmont would truly require. She thought again of the Duke's words, and instead of letting them wound her, she let them settle into something useful, a quiet fuel beneath everything she planned to do. He had told her to know her place. Very well. She would show him precisely what her place could become, built stone by stone, field by field, with her own hands and her own mind, until no one in the county could look at her and see only a woman who had been put in her place at a dinner table. She would see to it that when his name was spoken, so too would be hers, not as an afterthought, but as an equal. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes gently, but inside, by the light of the fire, Evelyn Hartley sat calm and certain, already beginning to plan a future that no one at that dinner table could have imagined for her. The morning after held no trace of hesitation in her step. She rose before the household stirred, dressed for travel, and by the time Margaret came down for breakfast, Evelyn already had her coat over her arm. "You are going somewhere," Margaret observed. "To Fairmont," Evelyn said. "I mean to see it with my own eyes before I decide anything further." Margaret considered arguing, considered reminding her niece of propriety, of the impression it might make for a young unmarried woman to ride out alone to inspect a derelict estate. But she had learned over the years that some battles were not worth fighting, especially against a will as firm as Evelyn's. "Take Thomas with you," Margaret said instead, naming their elderly groundskeeper. "At least let it be said you did not go entirely unaccompanied." Evelyn agreed, mostly to ease her aunt's mind, and within the hour she was riding out along the country road that would lead her, eventually, toward the low stone walls and overgrown hedges of Fairmont Estate. The ride took the better part of 2 hours, the road narrowing as it left the main village behind, winding instead through quiet farmland and patches of woodland turning gold and copper with the season. Evelyn found herself unexpectedly calm as she rode. Her earlier anger settled now into something clearer, more purposeful. When Fairmont finally came into view, she reined in her horse and simply looked for a long moment. The house itself was large, built of gray stone, with tall windows and a steep roofline that spoke of another era entirely. Ivy had crept up one entire wing, and several of the upper windows showed signs of broken glass. The gardens, once surely grand, had become tangled and wild, though beneath the overgrowth Evelyn could still make out the bones of what had been carefully designed pathways and hedges. It was not beautiful, not in its current state, but it was not without promise either. She dismounted slowly, walking closer, her boots crunching over gravel long since gone to weed. Thomas followed a respectful distance behind, saying nothing, though his expression suggested he understood exactly what price such restoration would demand. Evelyn walked the length of the front of the house, running her gloved hand along the cold stone, imagining it clean and repaired, imagining smoke rising from its chimneys once more. She thought of the fields beyond, currently untended, and pictured them plowed and planted, tenant cottages repaired, life returned to land that had clearly once thrived. And beyond those fields, though she could not see it from where she stood, she knew lay the boundary of the Duke's own land. A slow, quiet satisfaction settled over her. "It needs a great deal of work," Thomas said carefully, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," Evelyn agreed, "it does. It will cost more than the purchase price to restore it properly." "I know that as well," she said. Thomas studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as though finally understanding that no warning of difficulty would change her mind. "Then we had best see about finding you a good land agent," he said, "and a solicitor who will not try to take advantage of a young woman buying property on her own." Evelyn turned to him, surprised and grateful in equal measure. "You approve, then?" Thomas allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I served your father many years," he said. "He would not have raised a daughter who did not know her own mind. I see no reason to doubt her now." Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen at his words, some quiet fear she had not fully admitted even to herself. She looked back at the house, at its broken windows and tangled gardens, and felt, for the first time since the dinner at Ashcombe Hall, something closer to hope than anger. She would return home that day, begin the long process of inquiries and arrangements, of solicitors and agents and careful negotiations. It would not be simple and it would not be quick, but as she rode away from Fairmont that afternoon, glancing back once more at the gray stone house standing quiet against the autumn sky, Evelyn Hartley felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely certain of the path ahead of her. She would build something of her own. And she would build it close enough that the Duke of Ravensworth would never be able to forget her name again. The solicitor's office in the county town smelled of dust and old paper, and the man behind the desk, a Mr. Grantham, looked at Evelyn with an expression that was polite on the surface but doubtful underneath. "You wish to purchase Fairmont," he repeated, as though he had misheard her the first time. "Alone?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Is there some difficulty with that arrangement?" Mr. Grantham cleared his throat and glanced briefly at Thomas, who stood quietly by the door, before returning his attention to Evelyn. "It is simply unusual, Miss Hartley. Most young ladies in your position would have a husband, or at the very least a male relative, act on their behalf in such matters." "I have no husband," Evelyn said evenly, "and my closest male relative is a cousin in Ireland, who has shown no interest in my affairs for the past 6 years. I have the funds from my inheritance and I have made my decision. I would like your help in completing the purchase, Mr. Grantham, or I will find another solicitor who is willing to provide it." There was a brief pause, and then, to Evelyn's quiet relief, something in the man's expression shifted. Perhaps it was her steadiness, or perhaps simply the plain fact that her money was as good as any man's. He nodded slowly and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Very well," he said. "Let us begin with the particulars." The process, as it turned out, was neither quick nor simple. Fairmont's previous owner had died without a will that named a clear successor, and the estate had passed through a tangle of distant relations, none of whom wanted the burden of its debts and disrepair, but several of whom seemed determined to extract as much money as possible before releasing their claim. Weeks passed in a slow exchange of letters, meetings, and careful negotiation, during which Evelyn learned more about property law than she had ever expected to know. She also learned, to her quiet frustration, that word of her intentions had begun to spread. They are saying in the village that you mean to buy Fairmont simply to spite the Duke, Margaret told her one evening, setting down her needlework with a troubled expression, that you have taken leave of your senses over a single remark at dinner. Let them say what they like, Evelyn replied, though the words stung more than she wished to admit. My reasons are my own. Are they? Margaret asked gently. Evelyn, I do not doubt your capability. I have never doubted it. But I would hate to see you ruin yourself financially over a matter of pride. Evelyn set down her cup and considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. She thought of the ledgers she had already begun reviewing, the fields she had walked, the quiet calculations she had made about tenant rents and repair costs, and the slow, patient work of bringing land back to life. It began with pride, she admitted. I will not pretend otherwise. But it has become something more than that. I want to build something, Aunt Margaret. Something that is entirely mine, built by my own judgment and my own labor. If it happens to sit beside the Duke's land, then so be it. I will not apologize for where the opportunity presented itself. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, satisfied, it seemed, that her niece's determination rested on firmer ground than wounded feelings alone. The greatest obstacle, however, came not from doubtful solicitors or gossiping neighbors, but from another buyer. Evelyn learned of him through Mr. Grantham, who arrived one afternoon with news that made his expression graver than usual. There is another party interested in Fairmont, he said. A Mr. Edmund Colston, a merchant from the north with considerable means. He has offered a sum higher than what we proposed. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice calm. How much higher? Mr. Grantham named the figure, and Evelyn did the arithmetic quickly in her mind. It was more than she could match without depleting nearly every resource she had, leaving nothing for the repairs the estate so badly needed. What does Mr. Colston intend to do with the property? She asked. I understand he means to strip it, Mr. Grantham said carefully. Sell off the timber, the stone, whatever holds value, and abandon the rest. He has no interest in the house itself, nor in the tenants who remain on the land. Something cold settled in Evelyn's chest at the thought of the estate she had already begun, in her mind, to picture restored, being instead torn apart for quick profit, its remaining tenant families left with nothing. That cannot be allowed to happen, she said quietly. I agree it would be a poor outcome, Mr. Grantham said, but Miss Hartley, I must be honest with you, unless you can raise your offer, or unless the family selling the estate values something beyond the highest bidder, I do not see how we prevent it. Evelyn spent that night awake again, turning the problem over in her mind. She thought of her father's old friend, a banker in the county town who had always spoken kindly of her family, and by morning she had a plan, uncertain but worth attempting. She rode out early, alone this time, having grown impatient with waiting for company, and arrived at the bank just as it opened. The banker, a Mr. Fielding, greeted her with surprise but genuine warmth, remembering her father fondly. I need a loan, Evelyn said plainly, once they were seated in his office. Secured against my inheritance and against the future income of Fairmont's tenant farms, once I have restored them to working order. I understand it is unusual for a woman to request such a thing, but I ask that you judge the proposal on its merits rather than on convention. Mr. Fielding listened carefully as she laid out her figures, her projections for rent income once repairs were complete, her calculations for the cost of restoration spread over several years rather than all at once. She had prepared thoroughly, and it showed in every answer she gave to his questions. Your father would have approved of this plan, Mr. Fielding said finally, leaning back in his chair. He always said you had a sharper head for figures than most men he knew in business. Does that mean you will consider the loan? Evelyn asked, not allowing herself to hope too openly. It means, Mr. Fielding said, that I will grant it, on the condition that you allow my office to review your accounts each year, as a matter of due diligence, nothing more. Relief flooded through Evelyn so suddenly that she had to steady her hands in her lap. Thank you, she said. You will not regret this decision. With the loan secured, Evelyn returned to Mr. Grantham with a new offer, enough to match Mr. Colston's bid, though it left her with little margin for error in the months ahead. The family selling Fairmont, weary of the prolonged dispute and perhaps swayed by Mr. Grantham's quiet mention that Evelyn intended to preserve the estate rather than dismantle it, accepted her offer within the week. The day the papers were finally signed, Evelyn sat in Mr. Grantham's office and stared at her own signature on the deed, feeling a mixture of triumph and disbelief so strong it left her briefly speechless. It is done, Mr. Grantham said, sliding the paper toward her with something that looked almost like respect. Fairmont belongs to you, Miss Hartley. Word of the sale spread through the county quickly, as such things always did. Evelyn heard, secondhand, that the news had reached Ashcombe Hall within days, though what the Duke himself thought of it she could not say. She told herself she did not care. She told herself this several times over the following weeks, as she began the enormous task of preparing to move into Fairmont, hiring workers to begin the most urgent repairs, meeting with the estate's remaining tenants to reassure them that their homes were not, after all, to be sold out from beneath them. The tenants, she found, greeted her arrival with cautious hope rather than outright welcome. An elderly farmer named Joseph Bell, who had worked Fairmont's land for over 30 years, spoke for many of them when she visited his modest cottage to introduce herself properly. "We heard you meant to keep us on," he said, studying her carefully, "and not sell off what little we have." "That is my intention," Evelyn confirmed. "I know the roof of your cottage leaks, and I know the north field has gone fallow for want of proper drainage. I mean to see both repaired before winter sets in fully." Joseph Bell's weathered face broke into a slow, surprised smile. "Forgive me, miss, but that is more than any owner has promised us in some years." "Then I intend to be better than any owner you have had in some years," Evelyn said simply. As autumn deepened and the first repairs began at Fairmont, scaffolding rising along the damaged east wing, workers clearing the tangled gardens, Evelyn found herself, more often than she expected, standing at the edge of her new property, looking east toward the low stone wall that marked the boundary between her land and the Duke's. She had not yet seen him since the night of the dinner. She wondered, sometimes, what he had thought upon hearing that the woman he had so casually dismissed now owned the estate beside his own. She told herself it did not matter what he thought. But she found herself, more than once, glancing toward that boundary wall with a small, private satisfaction that she did not fully examine, and did not yet wish to. Winter arrived at Fairmont before all the repairs were finished, and Evelyn learned quickly that restoring an estate was not a task that paused for the seasons. Frost crept over the half-mended roof of the east wing, and the workmen grumbled about the cold even as they continued their labor, urged along by Evelyn's steady presence and her habit of bringing hot tea to the men herself when the mornings grew especially bitter. She had taken up residence in the house's western rooms, the only section fully weatherproofed so far, and she often worked by candlelight late into the evening, reviewing accounts, writing to merchants about the price of timber and stone, and drafting careful letters to the tenant families about repairs still to come. It was on one such cold morning, with frost thick on the fields and her breath visible in the air, that Evelyn first encountered the Duke of Ravensworth on the boundary line between their two estates. She had walked out early, as she often did, to inspect the drainage work being done along the northern edge of Fairmont's land, work that ran close to the low stone wall separating her property from his. She had not expected to find anyone else there at such an hour, and so she was startled to see a rider approaching from the opposite direction, moving at an unhurried pace along the wall. She recognized him instantly, even at a distance, by the set of his shoulders and the dark, well-fitted coat that marked him clearly as a man of considerable means. Her stomach tightened, though she kept her expression carefully composed as he drew closer and reined in his horse a short distance away. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, his tone giving nothing away, "I confess I did not expect to find you standing in a half-frozen field at this hour. And I did not expect to find your Grace riding the boundary of his own land so early," Evelyn replied evenly. "It seems we have each surprised the other." Something flickered across his face, though whether it was amusement or irritation she could not tell. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said. "Fairmont, I am told, now belongs to you." "It does," Evelyn said. "I trust that does not trouble your Grace." "Should it trouble me?" he asked, his voice carrying the faintest edge. "I could not say," Evelyn replied. "You seem to have strong opinions, the last time we spoke, about what a woman ought to be capable of managing." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might simply ride on without further comment. Instead, he dismounted, standing now on the opposite side of the low stone wall, close enough that she could see the tightness around his eyes, the faint shadows suggesting he had slept little the night before. "I recall the conversation," he said. "I do not recall inviting you to purchase land beside mine as a means of proving me wrong." "I did not purchase it for your benefit, your Grace," Evelyn said. "I purchased it for my own. That it happens to sit beside your estate is, I assure you, a matter of opportunity rather than design." It was not entirely true, and she suspected he knew it, but she held his gaze steadily, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her waver. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn found herself unexpectedly aware of the quiet of the morning around them, the frost-covered fields stretching in every direction, the soft sound of his horse shifting its weight nearby. Fairmont has not seen a competent owner in over a decade, he said finally. Its debts were considerable, its tenants neglected, and its fields, by all reports, poorly managed for years before that. You have taken on a heavy burden, Miss Hartley. I am aware of the burden, Evelyn said. I have spent every week since the purchase addressing it directly. I imagine your own steward has kept you informed of the roof repairs, the drainage work, and the new arrangements I have made with the tenant families. Something in the Duke's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine surprise. You have already begun such extensive work? Did you expect me to leave the estate to crumble further while I sat idle in a drawing room? Evelyn asked, unable to keep a trace of sharpness from her voice. The Duke's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close to it. I confess, Miss Hartley, I am uncertain what to expect from you at all. Then perhaps, Evelyn said, your Grace ought to reserve judgment until he has better information. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind moving across the frosted fields. Then the Duke inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have been respect, or might simply have been acknowledgement that the conversation had reached a natural end. I wish you good fortune with your repairs, he said, though his tone remained guarded. Fairmont's drainage, in particular, has long affected the lower fields on my own land. I trust your improvements will not worsen matters on my side of the boundary. Evelyn's chin lifted slightly at the implication. I have engaged a competent engineer, Your Grace, who has assured me the new drainage will improve conditions on both sides of the wall, not merely mine. We shall see, the Duke said, though there was less hostility in the words than there might have been a month earlier. He remounted his horse then, pausing only a moment longer before adding, almost as an afterthought, You surprised a great many people with this purchase, Miss Hartley. I confess I did not think you the type to make such a dramatic gesture over a single evening's conversation. It was not merely a gesture, Evelyn said. It was a decision. There is a difference, Your Grace, though I understand it may not have been obvious to you at the time. The Duke held her gaze a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression, before turning his horse and riding off along the boundary wall without another word. Evelyn stood in the frosted field long after he had disappeared from view, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit, though whether from anger or something else entirely, she could not say. Over the following weeks, such encounters became, if not common, at least no longer entirely unexpected. The drainage work along the boundary required frequent coordination between Fairmont's workers and the Duke's own steward, a stern, capable man named Mr. Fenwick, no relation to Evelyn's aunt, who at first seemed skeptical of taking direction from a young woman, but gradually came to respect the clear, sensible instructions she provided. The Duke himself appeared occasionally during these exchanges, always with some reason connected to his own estate's interests, though Evelyn began to suspect, though she never said so aloud, that his visits were not always strictly necessary. Their conversations remained cautious, often edged with the same sharp exchanges that had marked their first meeting at the boundary wall, but something had begun, slowly, to shift beneath the surface of their rivalry. Evelyn found herself, despite her earlier resolve to dismiss him entirely, paying closer attention to the Duke's manner when he spoke with his own tenants, noting the quiet fairness with which he handled disputes, the genuine concern he showed when a family on his land fell ill during the harsh winter months. It did not erase the memory of his words at the dinner table, but it complicated the simple image of arrogance she had carried away from that evening, replacing it with something less easily dismissed. For his part, the Duke seemed equally unable to maintain his earlier certainty about her. He watched, as the weeks passed, as Fairmont's roof was repaired before the worst of winter's storms arrived, as its fields were prepared with careful attention for the coming planting season, as its tenants spoke of their new landlady with growing warmth rather than the wary doubt they had shown at first. One particularly cold evening in late winter, a dispute arose over the shared stream that ran along the boundary between their two properties, its flow altered by Evelyn's drainage improvements in ways that Mr. Fenwick claimed were affecting the Duke's lower pastures. Evelyn, unwilling to let the matter fester into open conflict, sent a formal request for a meeting to discuss the issue directly, rather than allowing it to be settled through the slow, frustrating exchange of messages between stewards. The Duke agreed, and they met not at Ashcombe Hall, nor at Fairmont, but at the boundary itself, standing on opposite sides of the low stone wall, as they had that first frosted morning, though this time with maps and surveys spread between them on a makeshift table, brought out for the purpose. Your engineer's changes have raised the water level on my side by nearly a foot, the Duke said, tapping a finger against the survey map. My lower pastures have flooded twice this month already. I am aware of the flooding, Evelyn said, and I have already instructed my engineer to adjust the culvert here. She pointed to a specific location on the map. It should redirect the excess flow back into the original channel without affecting either property adversely. The Duke studied the map for a long moment, his brow furrowed in genuine consideration rather than dismissal. This adjustment, he said slowly, would require cooperation from both estates. The culvert sits partly on my land. Then I propose we share the cost of the repair, Evelyn said, in proportion to the benefit each estate receives. I have calculated the figures already, if your grace would care to review them. She handed him a neatly written page of figures, and he read through it carefully, his expression unreadable, before finally looking up at her with something that might have been reluctant respect. These figures are sound, he admitted. More thorough, in fact, than what my own steward provided me last week. I find it wise, Evelyn said, to understand every detail of a problem before proposing its solution. The Duke's mouth curved slightly at that, and for a moment, standing there in the cold with maps spread between them, something almost like understanding passed between them, fragile and new, unspoken but unmistakably present. Very well, Miss Hartley, he said. I accept your proposal. It was a small agreement, practical and unremarkable on its surface, but as Evelyn rode back toward Fairmont that evening, she found herself thinking not of the culvert or the shared costs, but of the Duke's expression as he had studied her figures, the quiet respect that had, for just a moment, replaced the guarded coldness she had grown accustomed to seeing in him. She told herself it meant nothing beyond a practical resolution to a shared problem. She was not entirely certain she believed it. Spring came slowly to the county that year, the frost lingering longer than usual before finally giving way to soft rain and the first green shoots pushing through the fields. At Fairmont, the change of season brought its own flurry of activity, planting to organize, fences to mend, and the steady, satisfying work of watching a neglected estate begin, finally, to show signs of life. Evelyn had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her new life, rising early, walking the fields with her steward, reviewing accounts by candlelight, and though the work remained demanding, she found in it a satisfaction she had never quite experienced before. The particular pride of watching something broken slowly mend under her own careful attention. She had also grown accustomed, though she was reluctant to examine the feeling too closely, to the increasingly frequent presence of the Duke of Ravensworth along the boundary between their estates. Their meetings, which had begun out of necessity over the shared stream and drainage concerns, had gradually extended into other matters, a dispute over grazing rights on a small strip of contested land, a discussion about the timing of the spring planting that affected tenant farmers on both sides of the wall, an exchange of advice regarding a particularly stubborn outbreak of blight that threatened crops on both estates. Evelyn told herself each time that these meetings were purely practical, born of the simple necessity of two neighboring landowners coordinating their affairs, but she noticed, increasingly, that the Duke seemed to find reasons for such meetings more often than strict necessity required, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not entirely mind. One afternoon in early April, she encountered him not at the boundary wall, but at the edge of the village market, where she had gone to purchase seed for the kitchen garden she was slowly restoring behind the main house. He was examining a display of farming tools with the focused attention of a man genuinely interested in their quality, rather than merely passing time. "Miss Hartley," he said, looking up as she approached, "I did not expect to find you here." "Nor I you, Your Grace," Evelyn replied. "I confess I did not think dukes concerned themselves with the quality of common farming tools." "This duke does," he said, "when his tenants complain that the tools provided to them are of poor quality and break within a season. I find it easier to judge such matters myself than to rely entirely on second-hand reports." Evelyn felt a small flicker of surprise at this, though she tried not to let it show too plainly on her face. "That is more attentive than I expected," she admitted. "You seem to have expected very little of me from the start," the Duke observed, though there was no real bitterness in the words, more a quiet, thoughtful acknowledgement. "You gave me little reason to expect otherwise," Evelyn said, "at our first meeting." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping briefly to the tools before him, before returning to meet hers directly. "I have thought often of that evening," he said, "more often than I care to admit." Evelyn's heart gave an unexpected, unwelcome flutter at his words, and she busied herself examining a nearby display of seed packets to hide her reaction. "Have you?" she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I spoke carelessly," the Duke said. "I have since had ample opportunity to observe that my words that evening were not merely careless but wrong." Evelyn looked up at him then, startled by the directness of the admission. That is not an easy thing for a man in your position to say. No, the Duke agreed. It is not. But I find, Miss Hartley, that continuing to hold a false opinion simply because admitting error is uncomfortable seems a poor use of a man's pride. There was something in his expression, sincere and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, that left Evelyn momentarily without a ready response. She found herself instead simply studying his face, searching for some sign that this admission was merely strategic, some calculated softening meant to ease tensions between their estates rather than a genuine change of heart. She found no such calculation in his expression, only quiet honesty. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saying so." They finished their errands separately after that, though Evelyn found her thoughts returning to the conversation for the rest of the day, turning his words over in her mind with a curiosity she had not expected to feel. The tenants on both estates, meanwhile, had begun to notice the shift in the relationship between their landowners, and word spread, as it always did in a small county, that the Duke of Ravensworth and Miss Hartley of Fairmont had moved from open rivalry to something closer to cooperation, if not yet outright friendship. Joseph Bell, the elderly farmer who had greeted Evelyn's arrival at Fairmont with cautious hope, mentioned the change to her directly one afternoon as she walked the fields, inspecting the progress of the spring planting. "Folks are saying the Duke has taken quite an interest in Fairmont's affairs," he said, a knowing glint in his eye that Evelyn chose to ignore. "The Duke has a practical interest in our shared boundary," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone carefully even. "Nothing more." "Of course, miss," Joseph said, though his smile suggested he was not entirely convinced. Evelyn found herself thinking, more than once in the weeks that followed, about the nature of her growing understanding with the Duke, uncertain whether to trust the warmth that had begun to color their exchanges. She had built Fairmont, after all, out of a determination to prove herself independent of any man's judgment, and she was wary of allowing that independence to be complicated by feelings she had not asked for, and was not entirely certain she welcomed. Yet she could not deny that their conversations had become something she looked forward to, that she found herself, on days when their paths did not naturally cross, inventing small reasons to walk toward the boundary wall in the late afternoon, just in case. The Duke, for his part, seemed equally affected, though he expressed it differently, through small, practical gestures rather than open declarations. He sent his own engineer to assist with a particularly difficult section of Fairmont's drainage system without being asked. He mentioned, in passing, that his library contained several books on estate management that she might find useful, and left them, unprompted, at the boundary wall for her to collect. He began, gradually, to seek her opinion on matters concerning his own estate, a shift so significant that even his steward, Mr. Fenwick, remarked upon it with quiet surprise. "His Grace has never before sought outside counsel on estate matters," Mr. Fenwick told Evelyn one afternoon, during one of their now regular meetings regarding the shared boundary. "He values your judgment a great deal, Miss Hartley, whether or not he says so directly." Evelyn did not know quite how to respond to this observation, and so she said nothing, though the words stayed with her long after Mr. Fenwick had returned to his own duties. It was not until early May, during an unusually warm afternoon, that the careful balance between rivalry and growing respect shifted into something else entirely. Evelyn had ridden out to inspect a newly repaired section of fence along the northern boundary of Fairmont, and found the Duke there already, examining the same fence with evident approval. "Your workers have done fine work here," he said, as she approached. "Sturdier than what I have on my own northern boundary, if I am honest. I could recommend the carpenter I employed," Evelyn offered. "He is skilled, and reasonably priced." "I would welcome the recommendation," the Duke said, then paused, studying her for a long moment before continuing, more carefully than before. "Miss Hartley, may I speak plainly?" "You have rarely done otherwise, Your Grace," Evelyn said, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster at the seriousness in his tone. "When you purchased Fairmont," he said, "I believed, at first, that you had done so purely out of anger toward me. I confess it wounded my pride somewhat, to think that a single evening's careless words had inspired such a drastic response." "They were not entirely uninvolved in my decision," Evelyn admitted honestly. "I understand that now," the Duke said. "But I have also come to understand that your purchase was never merely about proving me wrong. It was about proving something to yourself, about the life you were capable of building, independent of anyone's approval, including mine." Evelyn felt a lump rise unexpectedly in her throat at how precisely he had understood her, more precisely perhaps than even she had fully articulated to herself. "That is true," she said quietly. "I admire it," the Duke said, his voice softer now than she had ever heard it. "More than I know how to properly express. You have built something remarkable here, Miss Hartley, through your own determination and skill, and I find that I think of you, and of Fairmont, far more often than is strictly necessary for a matter of shared boundaries and drainage disputes." The words hung in the warm spring air between them, and Evelyn found herself, for once, entirely without a ready response, her earlier certainty about the simple, practical nature of their relationship dissolving under the weight of his honesty. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain how to continue. "Julian," he said quietly. "I would ask that you call me Julian, at least when we speak this plainly." Evelyn studied his face, searching, as she had before, for some sign of insincerity, and found none. Only quiet, steady honesty, and something warmer beneath it that she was no longer entirely able to deny recognizing, because she felt an answering warmth stirring within herself as well. "Julian," she said softly, testing the name, and found that it suited him better than his title ever had in her mind. He smiled then, a real smile, unguarded and warm, the first she had seen from him since she had known him. "Evelyn," he said in turn, and the sound of her given name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver through her, entirely unrelated to the mild spring air around them. They said little more that afternoon, standing together at the mended fence line as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. But something had shifted between them, quietly and unmistakably, and Evelyn rode back toward Fairmont that evening, with her thoughts far less settled than they had been in months. She did not yet know what to make of the warmth growing steadily beneath her earlier resolve to remain entirely independent of any man's regard, but she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was no longer entirely certain she wished to resist it. Summer settled over the county with long, warm days and fields ripening steadily toward harvest, and Fairmont, under Evelyn's careful management, had begun to look less like a neglected ruin and more like the thriving estate her father might once have imagined for her. The tenant cottages had new roofs. The fields showed healthy, well-tended crops. The gardens, though still a work in progress, had begun to reveal the elegant design hidden beneath years of overgrowth. Evelyn's friendship with Julian, as she now allowed herself to think of him privately, had deepened steadily through the summer months, marked by frequent meetings at the boundary wall, shared meals when their respective duties allowed, and long conversations that ranged far beyond estate matters into subjects both had rarely discussed with anyone else: hopes for the future, memories of parents long past, the particular loneliness that came with responsibility too great to easily share. Neither had spoken directly of what this growing closeness meant, both perhaps wary of disturbing something still new and uncertain, with words that might demand more than either felt ready to promise. But the warmth between them was unmistakable, noticed by tenants on both estates, remarked upon quietly by Margaret during her occasional visits, and felt, deeply and undeniably, by Evelyn herself, though she remained cautious about naming it even in her private thoughts. It was a warm night in late July when everything changed. Evelyn had retired early, exhausted after a long day overseeing the early stages of harvest preparation, and had fallen into a deep sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. She woke, sometime past midnight, to the sound of shouting outside, and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her open window. She was out of bed and at the window within moments, her heart lurching at the sight that greeted her. Flames, bright and terrible against the dark sky, rose from the direction of the tenant cottages at the eastern edge of Fairmont's land, near where several families, including Joseph Bell's, had their homes. Evelyn did not pause to dress properly, throwing on the nearest clothing she could find and racing downstairs, shouting for the household staff to wake and gather every bucket, every length of rope, anything that might help. By the time she reached the cottages, several were already ablaze, the dry summer heat and a stubborn wind spreading the fire faster than anyone could contain it with the limited resources at hand. Families stumbled from their burning homes, children crying, elderly residents struggling to move quickly enough, and Evelyn threw herself immediately into the chaos, directing workers to form a line from the nearest well, helping an elderly woman clear of the smoke, and shouting instructions over the roar of the flames and the panicked cries around her. She had not expected help to arrive from beyond her own estate, and so she felt a fierce, overwhelming relief when she heard the sound of horses approaching at a gallop and saw, in the flickering firelight, Julian himself leading a group of his own men toward the burning cottages, having seen the glow of the flames from Ashcombe Hall, and ridden immediately to help. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, running toward her through the chaos, his expression fierce with concern. "Evelyn," he called, "are you hurt?" "No," she said quickly. "But the Bell family, they are still inside. The smoke is too thick. They cannot find their way out." Julian did not hesitate. He turned immediately toward the burning cottage she indicated, calling for two of his men to follow, and disappeared into the smoke without a moment's pause for his own safety. Evelyn's heart seized with fear as she watched him vanish into the burning building, the flames licking dangerously close to the doorway through which he had entered. She wanted to follow, every instinct screaming at her to help, but she forced herself instead to continue directing the bucket line, trusting that panic would serve no one, least of all the family trapped inside. The moments that followed felt endless, the fire roaring louder, smoke billowing thick and black against the night sky, until finally, through the haze, she saw movement at the cottage door. Julian emerging with young Thomas Bell, Joseph's grandson, coughing but alive, cradled carefully in his arms, followed closely by his men supporting Joseph himself and his wife, both stumbling but breathing. Evelyn rushed forward as soon as they were clear of the immediate danger, helping to guide the family further back from the flames, checking each of them quickly for injury. Julian, having handed young Thomas safely to his mother's waiting arms, turned immediately back toward the fire, coordinating with his own men and Fairmont's workers to establish a more effective line of defense, using wet blankets and careful coordination to prevent the flames from spreading further to the neighboring cottages. They worked together through the remainder of that long night, side by side, exhausted and soot-covered, fighting the fire with a shared determination that erased, for those desperate hours, every remaining distance between Duke and estate owner, between title and independence. By the time the flames were finally brought fully under control, just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, 3 cottages had been lost entirely, but no lives, and the remaining homes had been saved through the combined efforts of both estates working as one. Evelyn sat, finally, on an overturned bucket near the smoldering ruins, utterly spent, her hands blistered, her clothes ruined, her hair falling loose and singed at the edges, and found Julian settling down beside her, equally exhausted, his fine coat lost somewhere in the chaos of the night, his shirt torn and streaked with soot. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "I do not know what would have happened to that family without your help." "You would have managed," Julian said, though his voice carried a warmth that suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. "You have managed everything else remarkably well since I have known you." Evelyn let out a tired, unsteady laugh. "I am not certain I could have managed a burning cottage alone, Julian." He looked at her then, his expression serious despite his exhaustion. "You would not have had to," he said. "I would always come, Evelyn, whenever you needed me. I hope you know that by now." Something in his tone, quiet and utterly sincere, brought unexpected tears to Evelyn's eyes, tears she attributed at first to simple exhaustion and the lingering fear of the night's danger. But as she looked at him, soot-streaked and weary, having run without hesitation into a burning building for tenants who were not even his own, she understood that her tears carried a deeper meaning entirely. "I know," she said softly. "I know that now." They sat together in silence for a long moment, watching the last embers of the fire smolder in the early morning light, the exhausted, grateful families of the rescued cottages gathering nearby, murmuring prayers of thanks, embracing one another with the particular fierce gratitude of those who have narrowly escaped tragedy. Joseph Bell approached them eventually, his face streaked with soot and tears, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed them both. "I do not have words enough to thank you," he said. "Either of you. You saved my family tonight." "You need not thank us," Julian said. "Any decent person would have done the same. Not every duke would have ridden through the night to save tenants belonging to another estate entirely," Joseph said quietly. "You have my gratitude, Your Grace, and my loyalty, for as long as I live." Julian seemed genuinely moved by the old farmer's words, though he simply nodded, unable, it seemed, to find an adequate response. In the days that followed, as Fairmont slowly began the work of rebuilding the lost cottages, with Julian's own workers assisting alongside Evelyn's, the bond between the two estates, and between their owners, deepened into something neither could any longer pretend was merely practical cooperation between neighbors. Evelyn found herself increasingly unable to imagine her days without Julian's presence woven through them, his steady counsel, his quiet strength, the warmth that had grown between them through months of shared challenges and mutual respect. She thought often, during the quiet evenings that followed the fire, of how far she had traveled from that humiliating dinner at Ashcombe Hall, from the anger and determination that had first driven her to purchase Fairmont, toward this new, unexpected place of genuine partnership and, though she was still cautious about naming it fully, something that felt remarkably like love. Julian, for his part, made no secret of his growing devotion, though he remained careful and respectful in expressing it, understanding, perhaps better than any other man in the county, how fiercely Evelyn valued her independence, and how important it was that whatever grew between them be built on genuine equality, rather than the old assumptions of duty and hierarchy that had first led him to speak so carelessly to her at that fateful dinner. One warm evening, as they sat together on the newly repaired steps of one of the rebuilt cottages, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Julian took Evelyn's still blistered hand carefully in his own. "I have thought a great deal," he said quietly, "about the man I was that evening at Ashcombe Hall, and the man I hope I have become since knowing you." "You have changed a great deal," Evelyn agreed softly, "though I think, perhaps, the capacity for kindness was always there, buried beneath old assumptions you had never thought to question." "Perhaps," Julian said, "but it was you who forced me to question them, Evelyn. You who showed me, through your own strength and determination, exactly how wrong I had been." Evelyn smiled softly, watching the last light of the sunset fade slowly toward evening. "I did not do it for you," she said honestly. "I did it for myself." "I know," Julian said, "and that is precisely why I admire you as deeply as I do." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the stars began to emerge overhead, the warmth between them unspoken but unmistakable, deeper now than either had perhaps expected to feel again after everything the fire had revealed about the strength of their shared bond. Evelyn did not yet know what the future held, whether the growing warmth between them would lead towards something more formal, more permanent, or whether they would simply continue as they were, neighbors and partners bound by mutual respect and genuine affection. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever came next, she would face it not as a woman seeking validation from a man's regard, but as an equal, standing beside someone who had finally learned to see her exactly as she was. Autumn returned to the county nearly a full year after the night Evelyn had first walked out of Ashcombe Hall with the Duke's careless words still ringing in her ears, and the estate she had built in the months since bore little resemblance to the neglected ruin she had first walked through with only Thomas the groundskeeper for company. Fairmont's fields had yielded a full, healthy harvest. Its cottages, including the 3 rebuilt after the fire, stood sturdy against the coming winter. Its tenants spoke of their landlady with genuine affection, no longer merely cautious hope but settled, confident loyalty. Word of Evelyn's success had spread throughout the county over the preceding months, carried by tenant families, by merchants who had done business with her, by solicitors and bankers who spoke admiringly of the young woman who had transformed a failing estate into a thriving one within a single year. The same drawing rooms that had once whispered doubtfully about her purchase now spoke of her with a respect that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. It was in this changed atmosphere that the county's autumn gathering took place. A large assembly hosted, as it happened, once again at Ashcombe Hall, though under circumstances entirely different from that first fateful dinner. Evelyn arrived that evening with a confidence that had nothing to do with her dress, elegant though it was, and everything to do with the year of accomplishment behind her. She no longer entered such gatherings wondering whether she would be dismissed or overlooked. She entered as a landowner in her own right, respected for her judgment, her fairness, and her evident success. Julian greeted her personally at the entrance, his expression warm in a way that drew curious glances from several guests who had, by now, heard rumors of the growing closeness between the Duke and his remarkable neighbor. "You look radiant," he said quietly, offering his arm. "I feel rather more confident than I did the last time I stood in this hall," Evelyn admitted, allowing herself a small, private smile. "As well you should," Julian said. "You have earned every measure of that confidence." The evening progressed much as such gatherings always did, conversation and music and careful social maneuvering among the assembled guests. But Evelyn noticed, throughout, a marked difference in how she was received. Where once she had been an object of doubtful curiosity, she was now sought out for conversation, her opinions on estate management genuinely valued by other landowners eager to understand how she had achieved such remarkable results at Fairmont. It was near the end of the evening, as the guests gathered for a final toast before the gathering concluded, that Julian rose from his seat and requested a moment of everyone's attention, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room. "A year ago, in this very room," he began, and Evelyn felt her heart quicken, uncertain what he intended to say. "I made a grave error in judgment. I spoke carelessly to a guest at my table, dismissing her capabilities based on nothing more than old assumptions I had never properly questioned. I told her to know her place." A murmur moved through the room, several guests exchanging glances, clearly recalling the incident, or having heard of it since. That guest, Julian continued, his eyes finding Evelyn's across the room, left this hall that night and proceeded to demonstrate, more thoroughly than I could have imagined, exactly how mistaken I had been. She purchased a failing estate, restored it through her own skill and determination, and built something remarkable, not merely a successful property, but a genuine home for the tenants who depend upon her. She showed courage during a crisis that many far more experienced landowners might have struggled to match. And she showed me, through her example, precisely how narrow and foolish my earlier judgment had been. Evelyn felt her cheeks warm under the attention of the entire room, though she held herself steady, meeting Julian's gaze without flinching. "I owe Miss Hartley a public apology," Julian said, "for the words I spoke that evening, and a public acknowledgement that she has proven herself not merely capable, but exceptional, in every measure that matters." He crossed the room then, coming to stand before her directly, and the assembled guests fell into an expectant hush. "Evelyn," he said, his voice softer now, meant for her though the whole room could still hear it, "I do not offer this acknowledgement out of obligation, or duty, or any sense of noble condescension. I offer it because it is true, and because I have come to admire you more deeply than I believed myself capable of admiring anyone." He reached into his coat then, and Evelyn's breath caught as she understood, suddenly, what was about to happen. "I am not asking you to marry me out of any sense of correcting past wrongs," Julian said, kneeling now before her, ignoring entirely the murmur of surprise that swept through the watching guests. "I am asking because I want, more than anything, to build the rest of my life alongside a woman who has proven herself my equal in every way that matters, a woman I respect and admire and love more deeply than I ever expected to love anyone." Evelyn looked down at him, at the sincerity plain in his expression, at the ring he held carefully in his outstretched hand, and felt the full weight of the past year settle into a single, clear moment of understanding. She had come to this hall once, humiliated and dismissed, and had walked away determined to prove her worth on her own terms, independent of any man's approval. She had built Fairmont not to win Julian's regard, but to prove something to herself. And yet here he was, offering not the old assumptions of duty and hierarchy that had once wounded her so deeply, but a genuine partnership between equals, built on a year of shared struggle, mutual respect, and love that had grown slowly and honestly from that foundation. "I did not build Fairmont to become a duchess," she said softly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, though her words were meant primarily for him. "I know," Julian said. "I would never ask you to set aside what you have built. Fairmont remains yours, entirely yours, to manage as you see fit, for as long as you wish. I am not asking you to give up your place, Evelyn. I am asking you to let me stand beside you in it." Tears rose unexpectedly in Evelyn's eyes, though she smiled through them, feeling, for the first time since that painful evening a year earlier, a sense of complete and settled happiness. "Then yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears, "I will marry you, Julian, not as a woman finally accepting the place a duke has offered her, but as an equal choosing to build a future alongside a man who has finally learned to see her clearly." The room erupted into applause and warm congratulations as Julian rose and slipped the ring gently onto her finger, his expression alight with a joy that matched her own. Around them, the guests who had once whispered doubtfully about her ambitious purchase now offered genuine warmth, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full measure of what Evelyn Hartley had accomplished in the span of a single remarkable year. Later that evening, as the gathering finally began to disperse and the two of them found a quiet moment alone near the same dining room where it had all begun, Evelyn looked around at the space that had once held such humiliation for her and found that it no longer carried the same sting. "It is strange," she said quietly, "to feel such peace in this room, after everything that happened here." "Perhaps," Julian said, drawing her close, "because the room itself was never truly the problem. It was only ever the words spoken within it, and those words have finally been corrected." Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder, looking out through the tall windows toward the dark fields beyond, fields that stretched, she knew, from Ashcombe Hall's boundaries all the way to Fairmont's own. Two estates now bound not merely by a shared stone wall, but by a partnership built on genuine respect, hard-earned trust, and a love that had grown, slowly and honestly, from the ashes of a single careless remark. "To think," she murmured, "it all began with you telling me to know my place." Julian laughed softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. I have never been more grateful for my own foolishness, he said, since it led me, eventually, to you. Outside, the autumn stars shone brightly over the fields of Fairmont and Ashcombe Hall alike, two estates and two lives, now woven together into something neither had imagined possible on that cold evening a year before, when a young woman had walked out of a humiliating dinner with nothing but her own determination, and had built, through patience and courage and unyielding self-respect, a place entirely her own. In the years that followed their marriage, Evelyn and Julian built a life together that honored the independence each had fought to protect, rather than diminishing it. Fairmont remained under Evelyn's direct management, its accounts still reviewed personally by her each season, its tenants still greeted by her on her regular walks through the fields she had once found tangled and neglected. Julian never once suggested she set aside the work that had defined her, understanding, better than most men of his position, that her happiness depended upon continuing to build, rather than simply inheriting comfort. Their two estates, joined now by marriage as they had already been joined by geography, prospered together in the seasons that followed. The shared stream that had once caused such contention flowed smoothly through carefully managed channels benefiting both properties equally. The boundary wall that had once marked such firm separation between rival landowners became instead a favorite walking path for the couple, worn smooth by years of evening strolls taken together as the sun set over their combined lands. Joseph Bell lived to see his grandson Thomas grow into a capable young man, eventually taking over management of several of Fairmont's northern fields under Evelyn's careful guidance, the fire that had once threatened his family's home becoming, over time, a story told not with fear but with quiet gratitude for the night two neighbors had become something far greater than mere landowners sharing a boundary. Margaret Fenwick, Evelyn's aunt, remained a frequent and welcome visitor to Fairmont, often remarking, with quiet satisfaction, that her niece's father would have been prouder of her than words could properly express, not merely for the successful marriage she had made, but for the estate she had built entirely through her own determination before ever considering marriage at all. Evelyn herself, in the quiet moments she allowed herself for reflection, often thought back to that painful evening at Ashcombe Hall, the humiliation of being told, so publicly and so carelessly, to know her place. She no longer felt anger when she remembered it, only a kind of distant gratitude for the way it had forced her to discover exactly what she was capable of building, when given no other choice but to rely entirely on herself. She had left that dinner intending only to prove a man wrong. She had ended, instead, by proving something far more important to herself, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's judgment at all, and that the place she truly belonged was not one given to her by any title or any man, but one she had built, field by field and stone by stone, through her own patient, unyielding effort. And in the end, she had found, standing beside her at last, a man who had learned not merely to accept that truth, but to genuinely celebrate it, walking beside her as an equal across the fields they now called, together, simply home.